Assalamu alaikum, brothers, sisters, and friends. Welcome to a new episode of the GDM Show, the Global Dawah Movement Show. On this week's show, we're here with Brother Hamza. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
How are you, Brother Hamza?
Good to see you, bro.
Same, mate. Likewise. So, we've got a very special show planned for you guys this week and next week. It's going to be a two-part show, and it's to do with the scientific miracles in the Qur'an.
Yes.
The narrative that we see out there, which is that there are miracles in the Qur'an, the science proves the Qur'an, and so on and so forth, right?
Yes.
We'll be discussing this, and I have some very interesting questions I have lined up for you to really break this down.
Thank you.
And to share the truth, basically, with the people, right?
Yes.
So the first question I'm going to ask you, we'll go straight into this, that is, what are the scientific miracles of the Qur'an?
Okay, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. The scientific miracles of the Qur'an claim is usually articulated in the following three ways, and I have these written down. Number one, the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, did not have access to the scientific knowledge mentioned in the Qur'an, therefore it must be from God. Number two, another way of putting it is, no one at the time of revelation, which was the 7th century, had access to the necessary equipment to understand or verify the scientific knowledge in the Qur'an, therefore it must be from God. And number three, the Quranic verses were revealed at a time where science was so primitive, no human could have uttered the truths mentioned in the Qur'an, therefore it's from God.
Right.
So that's the kind of way many of the Muslims at different levels in society articulate a case for the Qur'an.
Right, okay, excellent. So before we go into the whole narrative, the first thing I want to ask you is for you to give us a bit of a background and why we can't claim a miracle, the scientific mentions in the Quran.
Okay, there are three major milestones to what I call this kind of science in the Quran movement. Yeah.
Right.
The first one is based on the book that was written by Dr. Maurice Bucaille called The Bible, the Quran and Science. It was written in 1976, and as you can imagine, this book basically said the Quran is in line with modern science, the Bible isn't. Muslims took this, translated it in many languages. I believe some people memorized more of this book than they did of the Quran, right? It just it was a movement. Even some academics have called this movement Bucaillism, okay? There are some journals that basically talk about this movement and refer to it as Bucaillism. The second milestone was something called Commission on Scientific Science in the Quran and Sunnah, which was a commission in the 80s that produced a video called This is the Truth, and this was run by Sheikh Abdul Majid Az-Zindani. Now what they did in the 80s, I believe it was 1981 or 1982, is that they invited scholars, scientists from the West to Arabia and basically somehow got them to say some special things about the Quran. But we now know this is not true. The majority of those scientists have retracted those statements or have said that we were quote mined or whatever the case may be. The third milestone for this movement is the popularizers. You had the likes of Dr. Zakir Naik and Sheikh Yusuf Estes and many other callers to Islam who basically have articulated this case. Even myself, I think about 3, 4, 5 years ago, I articulated something very similar, not as strong as this, but we have found out now that it's actually an incoherent and not very robust way of showing that the Quran is true. And the reason for that, just to end on this point, to answer this question, the main reason we can't claim miracles, and we're going to discuss many other reasons, is because of the knowledge of what science is as a method, and science is as a philosophy, meaning the philosophy of science. So if you go to the works of Goethe and Sober, Rosenberg, Stathis Psilos, another philosopher of science, and others, you see that science is limited. For example, it's based on induction. Not only on induction, but let's take induction as an example. Induction is a limited thinking process where you have a limited set of observations where you conclude for an unseen next observation or an entire set of observations, known as weak and strong induction. As you can see, that's probabilistic reasoning. It's not going to be 100% certain. It's always going to range from 0% to 99% because there's always a possibility of a future observation going against your previous conclusions, which were based on previous observations. An easy way of looking at it is using a crude example using sheep. Say I go to Wales and I want to find out what the color of sheep are. I count 1,000 sheep, they all happen to be white. So using induction, the next instance of sheep is going to be what color? White. Exactly, but that doesn't mean that's true because it might be black.
Right.
And because there are black sheep, right? Exactly. We used to sing in nursery rhymes, ba ba, black sheep.
Yeah.
So the point is, it just shows that concluding from limited observations doesn't give you certainty.
Right, okay.
And that's the beauty of science. It's supposed to change based on new observations, new understanding, new discoveries, and that's the beauty. Now, understanding this about science, and we've mentioned this in previous GDM shows, we would see that you can't now apply this to the Qur'an and claim miracle, because you have to prove, or you have to show, that the science that you think is factual is never going to change. That's absolutely impossible for many things. Like, you know, the philosophers of science and the scientists themselves say that science is revisable. And the other thing that you have to do is that the meaning you've chosen for a particular word in the Qur'an is the meaning intended by God. How do you know? If you don't have any hadith to explain it, you don't have ijma, a consensus to explain these words, then you have to rely on the Arabic language, and you have many layers of meaning for a particular word. That's how rich the Arabic language is. So how do you know this is the meaning that is intended by God?
You're basically digging yourself into a hole as well, because what you're saying is if science changes in 10 years' time regarding a scientific fact which you say is in the Qur'an, then what are you going to do? You're stuck.
Exactly. Imagine the 19th century Muslim use this narrative. The scientific fact of the time was steady state theory, the universe didn't begin. But the Qur'an says the universe began, the cosmos began. So what do? Reject the Qur'an or reject the science? And this is why in the second show, we're going to give you a really robust method on how to show how the Qur'an is timeless. And how you can reconcile these issues in such an amazing, empowering way.
Excellent. Now, I think that in itself is enough to make the point that we don't need to use the scientific miracles approach. However, the next thing I want to move on to...
But it's true, it's like Sheikh Akram Nadwi, may Allah preserve him, he says, don't bring things to the Qur'an. Let the Qur'an speak for itself. That we superimpose an empirical scientific paradigm of the Qur'an. How do you know it's relating to an empirical paradigm? It could be a spiritual paradigm. It could be an existential one. It could refer to so many different things. Allow the Qur'an to speak for itself.
And there is a paper on this, which we're going to link to in the video description as well.
It's an essay,
go and read further and study further. So the next thing I want to ask you or touch upon is previous civilizations. Now, there's this idea that we have as Muslims, is that, you know, the Prophet ﷺ, you know, he was the first one who mentioned some of these things. This knowledge wasn't present on the face of this earth before the Prophet ﷺ.
That's not true.
So exactly, that's the question.
So the question is, what you're saying, so I don't want to...
Well, I'll say the question being that...
That's it, bro.
Was this
Be assertive.
Was this knowledge there before the Prophet ﷺ?
Well, that's the point. No, it was. And that's why we need to learn our history. And I'm quite saddened that we even wrote an essay about this a few years ago, did webinars and tried to create a narrative. People still are not adopting this because they're still adopting a false historical narrative. Because people are saying, no one knew this information at the time in the 7th century. That's not true. Let me give you some examples. Consider the setting down of iron. In the Qur'an, in chapter 57, verse 25, the Qur'an says, and we sent down iron. Yes, this is relatively true, that in some meteorites you have iron ore, right? So iron was sent down from that perspective. Does that mean it's a scientific miracle? No, because you had the ancient Egyptians 1400 years before the prophethood of the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace, they described iron as ba en pet, which means iron from heaven.
Right.
This was like over 1,000 years before the Prophet ﷺ. So you can't claim miraculousness here. We're not saying the Qur'an is wrong. We're not saying the Qur'an borrowed from these civilizations. No. Okay, because the Qur'an, as we're going to discuss next week, uses words that have different layers of meaning that addresses different civilizations, different understandings. Because the whole point of these verses is for us to conclude that God deserves worship. So he wants a 7th century man to think about space in a 7th century way, to think about nature in a 7th century way, to conclude that God deserves to be worshipped. But the Qur'an is so timeless that it does it in such an amazing way, and we're going to discuss this next week.
Of course, that's going to be very powerful, sure. But
another example. Sorry, there's more examples. The moon being a broad light. The Qur'an says in chapter 10, verse 5, it is he who made the sun a shining light and a moon a derived light. Nuran means derived light. Now let's ignore how the word shining light and Nuran are interchangeable in the Qur'an. Let's ignore that for a minute. Let's just stick to the topic that some Muslims use this word Nuran to show that the moon doesn't have its own light because it reflects the light of the sun. Because Nuran means like a borrowed light. Yes, that's true. But 500 years BC, 1200 years before the prophethood, before the Quranic revelation, Thales said the moon is light from the sun. Another Greek, Anaxagoras, in around the same period, he asserted the moon doesn't have its own light, but light from the sun. What about, for example, the Big Bang? The Qur'an says in chapter 21, verse 30, have not those who disbelieve known that the heavens and the earth were one piece? Then we parted them. Yes, it's very ambiguous. We don't know the howness and the kind of intricate details. That's not the point of this verse. The point is for us to be in awe and for us to say that God deserves to be worshipped. But this doesn't really refer to the Big Bang, because what Big Bang? There are 20 different models, more than 20 models maybe. The quantum fluctuation model, oscillation model, the Friedman Lemma-Eritrea model, all these models. What model are we choosing here? And these are not even hardcore facts in science anyway. And not even that, you have Sumerian literature in the Epic of Gilgamesh that reflects this kind of narrative. It says, when the heavens had been separated from the earth, when the earth had been delimited from the heavens, when the fame of mankind had been established. And the Qur'an says, when the heavens and the earth were one piece and we parted them. Similar kind of narrative. Doesn't mean the Qur'an copied, doesn't mean the Qur'an borrowed, but you can't claim miraculousness here because it was already known by primitive civilizations. Does it mean it's wrong? No. But what it does mean though is we shouldn't read too many things into Qur'an, allow the Qur'an to speak for itself, which we're going to discuss next week.
Okay, so another question that follows on from this is that the Prophet ﷺ, well, there's this idea that's out there that he couldn't have had access to this information from other civilizations. No way he could have had this access. He wasn't learned, he wasn't around other civilizations and so on and so forth. We know this isn't the case. Is that correct?
Yes, the assertion is wrong. They can't claim, even if there was an accurate primitive understanding of science at that time available, the Prophet Muhammad upon him be peace couldn't have access to it at all. Yeah. Again, I'm sorry, this is false. It denies established history of Arabia, and it denies the prophetic traditions are authentic. For example, in Sahih Muslim, which is an authentic compilation of the prophetic traditions, the Prophet Muhammad upon whom be peace, he actually took medical knowledge from the Romans and Persians, which shows to us a beautiful teaching that when it comes to medicine and the sciences, you must share knowledge with your fellow human being. This is beautiful. It encourages the kind of cultivation of the sciences and the kind of sharing of knowledge. For example, and I'm going to quote the hadith for you, the prophetic tradition for you directly. The Prophet ﷺ said, I intended to prohibit cohabitation with the suckling women, but I considered the Roman and Persians, and I saw that they suckled their children, and this thing, meaning the cohabitation, does not do any harm to them. This is an authentic tradition which shows that the Prophet ﷺ had knowledge of other civilizations, namely the Romans and the Persians. Also, we have to understand that there was an exchange of cultures at the time. Look at the trading that they'll go to China to trade. What do you think they went? They went for a teleportation system, vowed months of silence, and then picked the goods and went back without speaking to anybody? No, they went on like horse and camel and goat, and they would exchange cultures and discuss. And this is why we even have concepts of linguistic borrowing. Cultures share different languages because of this interchange of cultures. So the point here is, it's highly bizarre for us to make such a claim that he couldn't have access to this knowledge. That's not true. Especially when in Egypt, in around, I think, the 6th century, they already had, in Alexandria, I believe, translations of Greek medical documents. I mean, it's not that far. They went to China, forget Egypt, yeah? Yep. So to make such a claim denies our own Islamic history, and it denies the prophetic traditions. And for example, if you look at the historian iERA M. Lapidus in his book, A History of Islamic Societies, summarizes this. He says, by the mid-6th century, as heir to Petra and Palmyra, Mecca became one of the important caravan cities of the Middle East. The Meccans carried spices, leather, drugs, cloth, and slaves, which had come from Africa or the Far East to Syria, and returned money, weapons, cereals, and wine to Arabia.
Okay, excellent. So I think you've summed that up very, very good. I think it's very clear that, we shouldn't be arguing scientific miracles in the Qur'an. It's not the right approach. We shouldn't be doing that.
There are many more miracles we could talk about.
And at the same time, we need to really emphasize that as Muslims, yes, we know that the Qur'an was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ. It came from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Everything it contains is from Allah. And it's the truth, it's accurate, and so on and so forth. But what we're saying is don't impose narratives onto the Qur'an itself, right?
And don't use a flawed methodology, because as we discussed, science is transient, is time-bound, and using a time-bound, limited transient methodology to prove something that you believe is timeless.
Yeah, that's the most powerful.
It's flawed, absolutely. And there's nothing wrong with something currently now scientifically contradicting the Qur'an.
Yeah.
Big deal. Where has science come from? Understand its philosophy, its method, how scientists derive knowledge from empirical data.
Yeah.
And if you understand that, you see, well, it might change. Next week they may say this, in 1 month this, in 1 year this.
Yeah.
And we've seen this when you look into the history of science, right? Take even evolution. Evolution has evolved as well in terms of the scientists understanding what evolution is from that perspective. So we need to relax and take a chill pill. However, the reason we're adamant in producing this narrative is because we need to change the narratives in the dawah, in calling people to Islam, because frankly it has created a lot of doubts and it's created a lot of what I call apostasies, because people have left the religion of Islam because the only thing we gave them was scientific miracles.
Yeah.
And then when they understood what science was, and they understood that actually, you know what, there was knowledge at the time, there was exchange of cultures, it decreases the so-called miracle claim.
Yeah.
Now, I had a conversation with a student of knowledge saying, yeah, but I knew this Arab speaker, he did the linguistic analysis and it was amazing, and it correlated to what the scientists are saying now. I'm like, wow. And I just said one thing. The reason you find it so amazing, because you already have iman, you already have faith that you know it's from Allah.
Yeah.
Give them that basis first, and then you could talk about these things if you want from a tadabbur, pondering perspective. But you can't claim it's a miracle, because I said, answer these two questions. Number one, is the science that you're trying to relate it to absolutely true? Can you prove that? Can you prove it won't change next year or in 2 years' time? Can you prove that we have all the number of observations we require for a particular phenomena to conclude that this is an absolute fact? No, you can't even claim that about many things in science, right? Number two, the meaning you've chosen for that particular word in the verse in the Qur'an, is that the meaning intended by God?
Yeah.
How can you prove such a thing? Because when you don't have the prophetic traditions to explain it, you don't have ijma'a of the scholars, consensus of the scholars, and all the other bits and pieces that you require for understanding the Qur'an, then you have to rely on the Arabic language.
Yeah.
Arabic language is very rich. It has many layers of meaning. Which one is the one intended by God? Now, if you claim all of them are, then that would support our narrative, which we're going to discuss next week. And just to introduce the narrative before we end, which is very important, the narrative that we're going to talk about is beautiful. We're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We're saying the Qur'an is multi-leveled and multi-layered. What does that mean? The words used to describe natural phenomena or things that appear to be natural phenomena or science, these words have many layers of meaning. And these layers of meaning address different mindsets, civilizations across time.
That's something far more profound.
It's very profound because the Qur'an doesn't have a language that represents a 7th century language. It's a language that is timeless. Yes, there may be some things that may be unscientific, but those are things that are only to encourage us to do more science and do more investigation. Because the Qur'an is not a book of science, it's a book of science. Because the Qur'an, the main purpose of these verses is to show that, look, you came from a blood clot or something that looked quite bloody, right? Or look at the orbits, look at the celestial objects and they seem to be swimming in the universe, they're floating or whatever the case may be. That should give a 7th century desert Arab a sense of awe and wonder, thinking, who has done this? Who created the physical causes in the universe to enable this to happen? He deserves to be worshipped. That's the conclusion, deserve to be worshipped. Not there's all these scientific miracles and details. It's not. The verses are quite ambiguous from that perspective. Deliberately to make you think. The Quran wants you to think about the most profound conclusion, that he deserves to be worshipped. Not that, you know, you have the embryological process in the Quran. That's not true. So we're going to discuss this new robust approach, and I think it allows the Quran to speak for itself. We don't impose an empirical paradigm. And I hope people listen to this.
I think it's been very profound. I think you've covered all the points very, very clearly. The next show is going to be a really, really amazing show, you know, which is going to basically give you something instead, which is far more powerful.
Yes.
Far more greater than anything else we've done previously regarding the scientific miracles. And it doesn't limit the Quran in any way.
We're going to show how timeless the Quran is, how profound the Quran is. And the examples we're going to give you are going to be mind-blowing. Bi-idhnillah, inshallah. So stick with us next week.
Stay tuned, So Jazakallah khair for watching. Hopefully this has been beneficial. Please make sure to like the video, share the video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum.